The world's oldest power grid, a forgotten civilization hidden in plain sight. For as long as we can remember, we've been told a simple story about human history. Civilization moves forward. Technology improves. Each generation is smarter, more advanced, more enlightened than the last. Stone tools become bronze. Bronze becomes iron. Steam becomes electricity. Electricity becomes digital reality. It's a clean, comforting line. But what if that line isn't real? What if history doesn't move forward, but collapses, forgets, and rebuilds on top of its own ruins? Look closely at the cities you think you know. Look up, not at the streets, not at the people, but at the rooftops, at the spires, at the domes, at the strange metal shapes crowning buildings we casually called temples, mosques, churches, fountains, or monuments. Shapes that don't quite fit the stories we were taught. Crosses that don't look like crosses. Crescents that don't look like crescents. Tridents, rings, spheres, rods, claws, and objects that resemble antennas more than symbols of faith. This is not a story about aliens landing from the sky. This is a story about something far more unsettling. The possibility that humanity inherited a global technological system it no longer understands and turned it into religion. The first crack in the official narrative appears in the early 20th century, during a grand celebration meant to glorify the past. In 1913, a massive exhibition was organized to commemorate the 300-year anniversary of a ruling dynasty. Architects were instructed to recreate the atmosphere of an old city, to visually represent tradition, continuity, and spiritual heritage. One of the central structures was supposed to resemble a traditional church, but something went wrong. The building didn't look like any church people recognized. The dome was wrong. The geometry was wrong. And at the very top, where a cross should have been, stood something entirely different. A trident-like structure, sharp, angular, and disturbingly mechanical. At first glance, it's easy to dismiss this as artistic freedom. The early 20th century loved experimentation. Art Nouveau, modernism, reinterpretation of old forms, architects played with symbolism all the time. That explanation would work if this were the only example. But it isn't. When historians began comparing this 1913 structure with much older sources, something impossible emerged. Travel journals and illustrated albums created by European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries show nearly identical buildings. Same strange domes, same angular finials, same non-religious geometry. These weren't fantasies. These travelers were not surrealist artists. They were engineers, cartographers, diplomats, and scholars sent to document foreign lands with precision. Their drawings were reports, not interpretations. And they saw structures that did not match any known religious canon. Near Narva, engravings depict a building officially classified as a church, but nothing about it resembles Orthodox or Catholic architecture. The dome is not symbolic, it is functional. The top looks less like a sacred emblem and more like a device. In Nizhny Novgorod, the same pattern appears again. Later reproductions awkwardly place crosses on top of these structures, but the base geometry remains unchanged. It's as if someone tried to overwrite meaning without changing the machine beneath. Even more unsettling is a stone tower sketched in 1799, decades before modernist architecture existed. Its top looks almost identical to the supposedly innovative designs of the early 20th century. This destroys the idea of coincidence. If artists centuries apart, across different regions, with different cultural backgrounds, all documented the same strange forms, then those forms were real, physical, common, and not decorative. The more these images are studied, the harder it becomes to believe that these were houses of prayer in the modern sense. The domes don't inspire humility. The spires don't symbolize salvation. They look engineered. And that raises a forbidden question. What if religion didn't create these buildings? What if religion inherited them? Imagine finding a massive industrial complex with no instruction manual. The machines are silent, the lights are off. You don't know what it produces or how it works, but you know it mattered. Over generations, stories replace understanding, ritual replaces function. The machine becomes sacred. This is how cargo cults are born, and history may be the largest cargo cult of all. The idea becomes impossible to ignore when the geography expands. These structures are not confined to one empire or one faith. They appear thousands of kilometers apart, in places that should have no connection according to conventional history. Move south, far from the cold cities of Eastern Europe, into the deserts of Africa. In Sudan, buildings traditionally labeled as mosques reveal symbols that do not belong to Islamic tradition. Forked crosses carved into stone. The same geometry found on ancient slabs buried beneath Russian monasteries. Architectural historians insist that tent-roofed temples are a uniquely Russian invention, born from wooden construction techniques and later banned by religious reform. They claim these forms have no analogs, then explain why identical stone tents stand in Africa. The coincidence becomes absurd when Western Europe enters the picture. In France, within the walls of a famous abbey, tour guides proudly point to a medieval kitchen, but remove the label and what remains is unmistakable. A complex tent-roofed structure with chimneys, turrets, and a central vault that resembles a technical installation far more than a place for cooking. The idea that monks designed an ordinary kitchen by copying sacred architectural forms makes no sense. A simpler explanation exists. The building was already there. The new occupants didn't understand it, so they renamed it. As these fragments connect, a disturbing pattern emerges. From Russia to Sudan, from France to the Middle East, the same architectural logic appears again and again. Different cultures, different religions, same forms. Walls and roofs can be borrowed, but the objects crowning these structures defy cultural explanation. To understand their purpose, you have to look at the skylines of old cities. 19th-century panoramas of Cairo, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Tunis showed domes topped not with queer religious symbols, but with rings broken at the top, spheres pierced by rods, stacked toroidal shapes, and elongated capsules. These are not ornaments. They resemble components. In Cairo, the middle bar of what should be a cross or crescent bends upward unnaturally, forming a shape strikingly similar to a tuning fork. In Damascus, minarets are crowned with donut-like rings threaded onto spires, sometimes paired with egg-shaped objects surrounded by thin rods. To a historian, these are decorations. To an electrical engineer, they look alarmingly familiar. Broken rings resemble open circuits. Toroids are used to accumulate charge and control magnetic fields. Vertical spires function as lightning rods or antennas. Now imagine these structures not as isolated buildings, but as nodes in a network, a citywide field of receivers, transmitters, and accumulators, an ancient grid. The thought becomes even more disturbing when you notice how standardized these elements are. From Tunisia to Jerusalem, the geometry repeats with mechanical precision. No regional flair, no cultural storytelling, just function. Metal structures contrast sharply with stone walls, as if they were added with a specific purpose in mind. When that purpose was lost, the objects remained and slowly transformed into sacred symbols. People began to pray to what once powered their cities. And that's when the timeline breaks completely. Because while architecture hints at advanced knowledge, everyday life in old photographs looks shockingly primitive. Donkey carts pass beneath structures that appear to belong in a science fiction film. People dressed in simple garments walk beneath devices that suggest mastery of physics. This contradiction extends beyond architecture. It infects warfare. By the early 19th century, European armies, supposedly the most advanced in the world, marched into battle wearing decorative uniforms and thin cloth leggings. At the same time, artillery fired shrapnel shells designed to shred human bodies with metal fragments. Armor had been abandoned centuries earlier, allegedly because firearms made it useless. But reality tells a different story. In the East, warriors continued to wear chainmail, metal bracers, and shields well into the 19th century. And history proved them right. Chainmail doesn't stop bullets, but it protects against fragments, ricochets, and secondary shrapnel, which cause most battlefield injuries. During the First World War, Europe relearned this lesson the hard way. Soldiers returned to steel helmets, body armor, and medieval-style weapons adapted for trench combat. This wasn't progress, it was rediscovery. Which leads to an uncomfortable realization. If humanity could forget the purpose of armor for 200 years, why couldn't it forget the purpose of something far more complex? Perhaps temples were not built as symbols of faith, but as machines. And perhaps what we call religion today is the echo of a forgotten technology. When sacred buildings start behaving like machines. Once you accept the possibility that temples may not have been designed as purely religious spaces, an entirely new layer of history begins to reveal itself. Suddenly, details that once felt ornamental start behaving like components, and structures we casually dismiss as symbolic begin to look disturbingly functional. The illusion fully breaks when we shift our focus away from temples and towards something even more ordinary: fountains. Across historical records, guidebooks, and city inventories, fountains are described as harmless civic decorations, places for water, refreshment, beauty. But when we examine old images from Malta, Baghdad, Tunisia, and North Africa, the label collapses. These are not simple water sources. They are massive, standalone structures, often covered, often elevated, and often crowned with the exact same metal elements found on temples and mosques: spires, spheres, rings, rods, egg-shaped objects, toroids. If the official explanation were true, these fountains should prioritize water delivery, pipes, basins, channels. Instead, we see stone pavilions topped with complex metallic assemblies that serve no hydraulic purpose whatsoever. Why would a fountain need an antenna? Why would a water source require a toroidal ring? Why does the same decorative language appear on buildings that allegedly serve completely different functions? From an engineering perspective, the answer is simple: they didn't. These fountains were not fountains, they were devices. Over time, the original function disappeared. The water stopped flowing, or the energy stopped being generated. The mechanism failed, but the structure remained, and people preserved it, copied it, revered it. The result is a civilization surrounded by machines it no longer understands, giving them comforting names to mask the ignorance. The mystery deepens when we step inside these buildings. Interior illustrations and early photographs of mosques, mausoleums, and so-called holy sites reveal something astonishing. Beneath the domes, hanging from ceilings, filling the airspace, are dense systems of chains, cables, and suspensions. These are not a few lamps. These are not chandeliers. They are entire networks. The sheer quantity of suspended elements makes it impossible to see them as lighting fixtures alone. They fill the volume of the building with metal. They hang in patterns. They create symmetry. They interact with the space itself. Anyone familiar with electrical engineering will recognize the resemblance immediately. This looks like internal rigging, shielding, field shaping, the inside of a transformer or a resonator chamber. When combined with the external metal finials and spires, the image becomes impossible to ignore. These buildings were not passive structures, they were active systems. And like all systems, they stopped working. But humans did what humans always do when knowledge is lost. They ritualized the remains. This is the textbook definition of a cargo cult. When people reproduce the external appearance of a complex technology without understanding its principles, believing that imitation alone will restore its power. Stone replaces metal. Chains replace wiring. Domes replace housings. Altars replace control panels. The shell remains. The soul is gone. And yet, the copying continues. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of sacred architecture across the world: extreme consistency without explanation. The same forms repeated across continents, long after their purpose was forgotten. The system becomes even clearer when the investigation moves eastward, to India. Indian temples are famous for their ornate carvings and religious symbolism, but above the decoration, above the mythology, something else stands out. At the very peaks of towering spires are structures that are shockingly familiar. Tridents, forked claws, multi-pronged metal forms. These are usually explained as symbols of deities, divine weapons, sacred metaphors. But symbolism fails to explain geometry. These elements are not stylized differently across regions. They are mechanically identical. Same proportions, same mounting logic, same orientation. Even more unsettling is where these same shapes appear next. At the heart of Russia. On the towers of the Moscow Kremlin. Old images and surviving architectural details reveal the same bifurcated and trifurcated finials. Official history calls them decorative eagles, abstract flourishes, or national symbols. But the geometry does not lie. You cannot accidentally recreate the same technical form across India, Sudan, Russia, and Europe without shared knowledge or a shared origin. No amount of cultural storytelling can explain this. And this is where the idea of a global architectural standard stops being speculative and starts becoming unavoidable. What we are seeing is not cultural exchange, it is inheritance. A standardized system once spanned vast territories of the planet, long before modern borders, long before organized religions as we know them, long before national identities. Temples, mosques, cathedrals, fountains, towers, all of them are fragments of the same infrastructure. Different societies inherited different pieces. Some adapted them as places of worship. Some turned them into civic structures. Some reused them as kitchens, warehouses, or monuments, but none truly understood what they were. The final blow to the official timeline comes from early 20th century photography. Among the archives are images so shocking they are often ignored or dismissed as fakes. A colossal metal structure towers over a city filled with horse-drawn carriages. The object looks like a Tesla generator, or a transmitter, or something pulled from speculative fiction. But the photo is real, and it exists in a time when humanity had barely mastered steam. The presence of such a structure suggests something historians refuse to confront. Advanced technology did not suddenly appear in the modern era. It survived, briefly, and then disappeared again. Perhaps intentionally dismantled, perhaps simply abandoned, perhaps rendered useless after the loss of supporting systems. What remains are the shells. Beautiful, mysterious, sacred, and completely misunderstood. If this interpretation is correct, then humanity did not slowly invent technology upward from primitive beginnings. It fell. And what we call progress is merely reconstruction, guided by fragments we barely comprehend. In the final section, we will connect these fragments fully. From ancient power systems to modern religious rituals, from forgotten grids to rewritten history, from lost function to sacred myth. Because once the pattern is complete, one question becomes unavoidable. If these buildings were machines, who built them? The civilization that forgot itself. At this point, the question is no longer whether something is wrong with the official story of history. The question is how deep the omission goes. Because once temples stop behaving like symbols and start behaving like machines, the entire framework of civilization has to be reconsidered. Across continents, across religions, across centuries, the same architectural logic repeats. Spires act like collectors. Rings act like accumulators. Spheres act like stabilizers. Chains act like internal conductors. Domes act like housings. Fountains act like terminals. This is not metaphor. This is system design. And systems are not built accidentally. When all these elements are viewed together, the image that emerges is unsettlingly clear. The planet was once covered by a unified technological network, not a power grid in the modern sense, but something older, stranger, and possibly more elegant. A system that interacted with the atmosphere itself, collecting energy, transmitting signals, stabilizing fields. A civilization that did not rely on fossil fuels, combustion, or centralized factories. A civilization that understood resonance, electricity, and the natural properties of the earth. And then something happened. The knowledge collapsed. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, unevenly, like a dimming light across the world. Some regions held on longer than others. Some continued maintenance without understanding. Some repurposed structures for new beliefs. Some dismantled what they could not explain. The system decayed. What remained were monuments. Humanity, faced with the ruins of something incomprehensible, did what it always does in the face of the unknown. It created myths. Religion did not begin as deception, it began as interpretation, an attempt to explain machines that no longer worked. Symbols replaced schematics, ritual replaced operation, priests replaced engineers. Over generations, the memory of function vanished completely. Only form survived. This is why religious symbols feel strangely inconsistent, why the same cross can mean different things in different eras, why crescents change shape, why tridents appear in cultures that never interacted. They are not theological inventions, they are corrupted technical diagrams. The trident is not a god's weapon, it is a bifurcated or trifurcated terminal, a forked conductor, a tuning element. The broken ring is not decoration, it is an open circuit. The egg-shaped capsule is not symbolism of life, it is a housing, a containment vessel, a capacitor-like form. The dome is not heaven, it is shielding. And the altar is not a place of sacrifice, it is where the operator once stood. This perspective explains one of the most haunting contradictions in history. The sudden appearance of religious uniformity over vast territories, the rigid repetition of forms that should have evolved but didn't. People weren't inventing new temples, they were copying old ones, trying desperately to recreate something that once worked. The cargo cult analogy is no longer hypothetical. Imagine finding an airport without understanding flight. Over time, you might worship the runway. You might build wooden airplanes. You might perform rituals hoping the gods will return. Not because you are foolish, but because you inherited ruins without manuals. Humanity inherited the same problem on a planetary scale. This also explains the strange regression in warfare, science, and infrastructure between the 17th and 19th centuries. The abandonment of armor, the loss of practical engineering wisdom, the prioritization of aesthetics over survival. Knowledge was not advancing, it was being filtered, simplified, forgotten. By the time industrialization began, humanity was reinventing technology from scratch, unaware it was walking among the remains of something far greater. The final proof of this amnesia lies not in ancient ruins, but in early modern photographs. Images from the late 19th and early 20th centuries capture cities where impossible structures still stand. Massive metallic frameworks towering over streets filled with horse-drawn carts. Devices that resemble generators, transmitters, or resonators existing in a world officially limited to steam engines and basic electricity. These were not future inventions, they were survivors. Fragments of a dying system photographed just before they vanished. Some were dismantled for scrap. Some were labeled dangerous, some were quietly removed. Others were absorbed into the narrative of religion and tradition. By the time modern historians arrived, the system was gone. Only stories remained, and stories are easy to control. Today, we walk beneath these structures without questioning them. We accept labels: church, mosque, fountain, monument. We stop looking up. But the buildings remember. They remember a time when humanity understood forces we barely acknowledge today, when cities were not powered by burning fuel, but by interacting with the environment itself. If this civilization was not extraterrestrial, then it was something even more unsettling. It was us, a previous version of humanity. Smarter in some ways, more reckless in others. Capable of building a global system, and capable of losing it completely. And here is the final, unavoidable question. If such knowledge was lost once, what guarantees it won't be lost again? History, as we are taught, is not a story of constant progress. It is a warning. And the domes above our cities are not symbols of faith. They are gravestones of forgotten science. If you want to understand the future, stop staring at screens. Look up, because the past is still watching us. If this video made you question what you thought you knew, share it, subscribe. And the next time you see a temple, don't ask what it means. Ask what it once did.